The first body I saw wasn't a stranger. It was Dennis Pruitt, who ran the hardware store on Caldwell Street for 31 years. He was face down in the parking lot of the Fuel and Go, with his jaw torn clean from his skull, and the thing crouched over him was still wearing the volunteer fire department windbreaker it must have died in 2 days earlier. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I sat behind the wheel of my truck with the engine idling and watched the thing press its face into Dennis's open neck like it was drinking from a creek. Then I put the truck in reverse, backed out onto Route 9, and drove east toward the prison. That was 6 days ago. I'm recording this because I think someone should know what happened here, even if no one ever hears it. My name is Cole Brannick. I'm 34. I was a corrections officer at Hargrove State Penitentiary for almost 7 years before the state decommissioned it in 2021. Budget cuts, declining population, asbestos in C Block. They had reasons. The county seat moved the remaining inmates to a facility downstate and left Hargrove to rot on 40 acres of dead farmland just past the edge of Sutterton. Population 3,000 and shrinking. 3,000 before all of this anyway. I don't know what the number is now. I try not to think about it. I knew the building. Every corridor, every service tunnel, every blind spot the cameras never covered. I knew which locks were mechanical and which were electronic. I knew that the backup generator in the maintenance bay still had fuel because I'd checked it myself 6 months earlier out of habit. Maybe nostalgia, maybe something else I didn't want to name. The point is, when the emergency broadcast cut out mid-sentence and the cell towers dropped and I saw Dennis Pruitt being eaten alive in broad daylight, I didn't have to think about where to go. My body already knew. Hargrove sits a quarter-mile off the road behind a perimeter of chain link topped with razor wire. The wire was rusted but intact. The front gate was chained with a county padlock I still had the key for. I'd never returned it, and nobody had ever asked. When I pulled through and locked the gate behind me, I sat in the truck for a long time. The prison looked the same. Gray concrete, narrow windows. Watchtower on the northeast corner with the searchlight housing still bolted in place. The yard was overgrown with thistle and crabgrass pushing through cracks in the asphalt. It looked abandoned. It looked like exactly what it was. I wasn't alone for long. Nora Voss showed up the next morning. I heard her before I saw her. The sound of someone banging on chain link with what turned out to be a tire iron. She was standing at the front gate with a backpack, a bruise across her collarbone, and a 10-year-old boy gripping the strap of her bag with both hands. The boy was her nephew, Liam. She didn't say much at first. She said, "Please," and she said, "They're coming from the west side of town." And she said, "I know what this place is." I opened the gate. Nora was a paramedic with the county. Had been, I suppose. She was lean, sharp-featured, the kind of person who looked at you like she was already triaging you. Liam didn't speak at all that first day. He sat on the floor of the intake processing room and pulled threads from the cuff of his jacket one by one, methodically, like he was performing surgery. I gave him a granola bar, and he ate it without looking at me. I didn't ask about his parents. Nora's face, when I glanced that direction, told me everything the silence didn't. By that evening, we'd secured the main entrance, barricaded the visitor processing corridor, and run an inventory of what I'd brought. The truck bed full of supplies I'd loaded in a 20-minute panic from my apartment. Canned food, water jugs, a first aid kit, 2 hunting rifles, a shotgun, ammunition, a hand crank radio that picked up nothing but static, batteries, duct tape, a wool blanket I'd grabbed without thinking that still smelled like my apartment, like coffee and the cedar block I kept in my closet. It already smelled like a different life. Hargrove was built in 1974 and expanded twice, which gave it the kind of layout that only makes sense if you understand it was designed in layers. The original structure was A block and B block, 2 rectangular housing units flanking a central control hub. The 1989 expansion added C block to the north, the infirmary wing, and the kitchen and commissary. The 2004 renovation brought the administrative offices, a second yard, and the maintenance bay with its generator and utility access. The whole thing was wrapped in a double perimeter inner wall of poured concrete 12 feet high, outer fence of chain link and razor wire with a 15-foot gap between them. I walked Nora through it on the second morning. Liam trailed behind us, not touching anything, just looking. The kid had enormous dark eyes that tracked movement the way a prey animal's would. Constant, peripheral, without ever fixing on a single point for long. "This is overkill," Nora said. We were standing in the central hub, a hexagonal room with reinforced glass windows overlooking both housing unit corridors. The control panels were dead. No power yet, but the manual overrides for the blocked doors were mechanical, lever-operated. I'd use them during drills. "It was built to keep people in," I said. "The geometry works both ways." She turned a slow circle. "How many cells?" 212 across 3 blocks. "We don't need them all. We need choke points. We need lines of sight. We need fallback positions if the outer perimeter fails." "You've been thinking about this." I had. Not specifically. Not a zombie plan, nothing that calculated. But in the years since I'd left Hargrove, something in the back of my mind had kept mapping it, kept running scenarios. When the first reports hit the news 4 days before the broadcasts died, unconfirmed attacks, a quarantine in Memphis, the governor's press conference, where he looked like a man reading his own autopsy, and that background process had moved to the front of my brain and started producing answers before I'd even finished formulating questions. "A block is our living quarters," I told her. "Ground floor, cells 1 through 12. Close to the kitchen, close to the hub, easy to seal. B block stays empty, buffer zone. C block has asbestos, so we stay out unless it's life or death. The infirmary has supplies, probably expired, but we inventory everything. The kitchen had industrial gas lines. If they're still connected, we have cooking heat. The generator gives us lights and water pumps, but we ration fuel. We run it 2 hours in the morning, 2 at night." Nora absorbed this without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What about the roof? What about it?" "Visibility. If there's a horde coming, I want to see it before it sees us." She was right. The roof of C block was the highest accessible point, and from there you could see clear to the tree line, a half-mile south, and the road curving in from the west. I'd been thinking about walls. She was thinking about horizons. It was the first time I understood that I'd need her, not just as another body, but as a mind that worked differently from mine. We set up a watch rotation that afternoon. 2 on, 4 off, cycling through the day. With only 2 adults, it was punishing, but there was no alternative. Liam helped in small ways, carrying supplies, sorting cans by type, holding the flashlight while I reconnected the generator's fuel line. He still hadn't spoken. Nora told me quietly, while he was asleep in cell 4 with the wool blanket pulled to his chin, that he'd watched his mother turn, that she'd come through the front door already bitten and had enough time to tell him to run before she stopped being herself. Nora had found him 2 blocks away, hiding under a porch. "He talked before," she said. "Full sentences, complex thoughts. He's not impaired, he's just sealed. Give him time." She almost laughed. "Sure." That night I climbed to the roof of C block and looked west toward town. The sky was orange near the horizon, something burning, big enough to glow but too far to hear. I counted the fires. 3 distinct sources. One of them was in the area of the school. I went back downstairs and checked the locks twice. On the 3rd day, Marcus and Joe arrived. They came from the south, on foot, moving along the drainage ditch that ran parallel to Route 9. Marcus Dela Cruz was carrying a compound bow and a duffel bag so heavy it had cut a red welt into his shoulder. Josephine Joe Quan was behind him, with a .2 pistol and a plastic bin of medical supplies she'd taken from the veterinary clinic where she worked. She was limping, not bitten. She'd stepped wrong on a culvert grate and twisted her ankle badly enough that it had swollen to the size of a grapefruit. I watched them from the watchtower for 10 minutes before I went down. Not because I was cruel, because I'd already started making calculations I didn't want to be making. 2 more mouths, reduced rations, one of them injured. But Marcus looked up at the tower like he knew someone was there, and he raised both hands, palms open, bows slung across his back, and said, loud enough to carry, "We're clean, we're not bit, and she's a vet tech, which is closer to a doctor than whatever you've got." I let them in. Marcus was 30, an Army veteran who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and come home to build furniture in his father's workshop. He had the specific calm of someone who'd been shot at and had made peace with the experience. Not cold, not detached, but operating on a frequency where panic simply didn't register. He assessed Hargrove in under an hour and told me 3 things I'd missed. The sewer grate in the maintenance bay could be breached from outside. The chain link on the eastern perimeter had a 4-foot section where the posts had corroded at the base, and the watchtower stairs had a structural crack that would fail under enough weight. I'd spent 7 years in this building and walked past those vulnerabilities every day. It took him 45 minutes. "Don't take it personally," he said, reading my face. "You see a place you know. I see a place I have to defend." Different eyes. Jo sat up in the infirmary and sorted her supplies, with her injured ankle elevated on a stack of folded inmate uniforms she'd found in the laundry room. She was methodical, quiet, with a dry humor that surfaced at unexpected moments. When Nora asked if veterinary antibiotics would work on humans, Jo said, "An infection doesn't care about your species. The bacteria aren't checking your insurance card." By that evening, we had a crew of 5, a plan, and an unspoken understanding that we'd been lucky, that the window for luck was closing. Marcus and I spent the next 2 days reinforcing. We welded the sewer grate shut using a portable torch from the maintenance bay. We braced the weak fence posts with angle iron bolted into concrete anchors. We stacked cafeteria tables against first-floor windows and secured them with rebar and wire. We filled gaps, sealed doors, created choke points where a hallway narrowed enough that only one body could pass through at a time. Marcus showed me how to rig simple noise traps, cans on wire, gravel in bottles, along the perimeter so we'd hear contact before we saw it. The physical labor was good. It gave structure, it gave purpose. It kept me from looking west. But on the 5th night, Liam spoke. I was on watch in the tower. He'd climbed the stairs without making a sound. I didn't know he was there until he said, in a voice so small it barely carried across 3 feet of air, "They're in the field." I looked. He was right. South, just past the tree line, moving through the waist-high grass with that distinctive stuttering gait. Stop, shift, lurch, stop. I counted 7 before the dark swallowed the rest. They weren't at the fence yet. They were moving generally east, parallel to our position. Drifting, but they were closer than anything had been since I'd arrived, and Liam had spotted them before I had. "Good eyes," I said. He stood there for a moment, watching them move through the grass, and then he said, "They don't get tired." It wasn't a question. We held a meeting the next morning in the kitchen. The gas lines worked. One of the few pieces of genuine good fortune we'd had. And Nora had made coffee from a can I'd brought from my apartment. Real coffee. A small luxury that felt enormous. We sat around a steel prep table that still had scratches from 1,000 trays sliding across its surface. 7 confirmed last night, south tree line, I said. Moving east. They didn't approach the fence, but that doesn't mean they won't. Marcus had his hands wrapped around his cup, thumbs tapping lightly. 7 we could see. Grass was high. Could have been twice that. Could have been, I agreed. "So, what's the play?" Jo asked. Her ankle was better. Still swollen, but she was putting weight on it. She'd fashioned a compression wrap from elastic bandages and moved with careful deliberation, testing each step. I laid it out. The outer fence was our early warning line. The inner concrete wall was our primary defense. If the fence failed, We'd fall back to the wall, if the wall was compromised. And I didn't see how. But Marcus reminded me that enough bodies pressing against anything would find its breaking point. We'd retreat to A block and seal the corridor doors. Last stand was the central hub, mechanically locked, reinforced glass, supplies for 72 hours. 3 layers, Nora said. And if all 3 fail, then we're on the roof and hoping someone's still flying helicopters. Nobody laughed. What about the boy? Marcus asked, not unkindly. Liam was in cell 4, reading a water-stained paperback he'd found in one of the common areas, a Western novel, of all things. He'd been reading it steadily for 2 days. Liam stays in A block during any engagement. Inner corridor, sealed door. Nora, you're his fallback. If things go wrong, you take him through the maintenance bay to the east fence, and you run. Nora's jaw tightened. I'm a paramedic. If people are hurt, Joe handles triage during engagement. You're Liam's lifeline. Don't assign me to... Nora. I kept my voice level. Someone has to be the person who keeps that kid alive. You're the person he trusts. That's not a demotion. That's the most important job in this building. The kitchen was quiet. Marcus looked at Nora. Joe looked at the table. Nora looked at me with an expression I recognized from corrections, the expression of someone deciding whether to accept authority or challenge it. She could go either way. Fine, she said, but I want a weapon. You'll have one. Marcus had been scouting the surrounding terrain from the tower, and he'd drawn a rough map on the back of a commissary inventory sheet. Hargrove sat on a slight rise, not much, maybe 15 feet of elevation above the surrounding fields, but enough to matter. The road approached from the west. South was open field turning to scrubby pine forest, about half a mile out. East was more farmland, flat and exposed. North was the old staff parking lot. Then a ravine with a creek at the bottom. Then dense woods climbing a ridge. If a horde comes, Marcus said, tracing the map with his finger, they'll come from the west. That's where town is. That's where the population density was. They follow noise, maybe scent. We don't know enough about what drives them. But they'll come from where the people were. Unless they come from the highway, Joe said. 94 runs north-south, about the 3 miles east. If there was an evacuation, there would have been traffic. Stalled cars, people trapped. Marcus nodded slowly. So they could come from the east too. They could come from anywhere, I said. But Marcus is right that west is the most likely primary direction. We reinforce accordingly. Western fence gets double attention. We extend the noise traps further out in that direction, and we establish observation protocol. Full 360 from the tower, but with priority on the western and southern approaches. That afternoon, Marcus and I went outside the fence for the first time since I'd arrived. Not far. Just along the perimeter, checking the wire from the outside, looking for weaknesses we couldn't see from within. The air smelled wrong. It had for days. But out here it was worse. A sweetness underneath the March cold that I recognized from the one time a pipe had burst behind the wall of a cell in B block, and they'd found a dead raccoon in the crawl space. Organic decay, carried on the wind from the direction of town. We moved fast. Marcus had the bow up, an arrow knocked. I carried the shotgun. We found 2 places where animals had dug under the chain link. Shallow divots, nothing that would admit a human body. But we filled them with gravel and stacked cinder blocks from a collapsed storage shed against the fence base. When we came back through the gate, Nora was on the roof with binoculars I didn't know she had. She climbed down and met us in the yard. There's smoke from town, she said. Less than yesterday? That's either good or bad, Marcus said. It's bad. It means there's nothing left to burn. The radio came alive on day 7. I was in the hub running the generator for the morning cycle when the hand crank radio sitting on the control desk where I'd left it, more out of ritual than hope. Hissed, crackled, and produced a human voice. I nearly knocked over my coffee getting to it. The voice was male, clipped, military cadence. It was a loop. a recorded message cycling every 4 minutes. I listened to it 3 times before I called the others. Repeat. This is a civil defense emergency broadcast originating from Fort Kessler, approximately 40 miles southeast of your position. Civilian evacuation corridors are no longer active. If you are sheltering in place, remain in your location. Do not attempt to travel on open roads. Infected density along major highways is extreme. Military containment efforts are ongoing. Resupply and evacuation timelines are not available at this time. Monitor this frequency for updates. Repeat. We stood around the radio in the dim light of the hub and listened to the message 4 more times, each of us pulling different information from the same words. Fort Kessler is real, Marcus said. Joint base, National Guard and regular Army. If they're broadcasting, they're still operational. They're also saying don't come, Nora said. They're saying the roads aren't safe. That's different. Is it? Joe was the one who asked the question nobody wanted to frame. What does containment efforts are ongoing mean? Are they holding a perimeter? Are they pushing out? Or are they losing and calling it containment because the alternative is admitting they've got nothing? I turned the crank and listened again. The voice was steady, professional. But there was something about the phrasing, timelines are not available at this time, that sounded like a man reading from a script he didn't believe. I'd heard that tone in prison administrators' voices during lockdowns that had gone wrong. The calm that exists only because actual communication has become impossible. We plan as if nobody's coming, I said. If someone does, that's a bonus. But we don't build around rescue. Marcus agreed immediately. Nora took longer, but nodded. Joe said, obviously, in a tone that suggested she'd already been operating on that assumption. That afternoon, I climbed to the roof and scanned the full perimeter. The fields were empty. The road was empty. The tree line was still, but the sky to the west had changed. No more smoke, just a flat gray haze that could have been weather or could have been something else. And there, at the very edge of what I could see with Nora's binoculars, a dark line along the road. I couldn't resolve it into shapes. It could have been cars. It could have been shadows. It could have been a long procession of figures moving very slowly in our general direction. I watched until my eyes ached and the light failed. And I couldn't be sure of what I'd seen. That night, I did something I hadn't done. Since arriving, I went into a cell. Not my cell, an empty one in the middle of A block, and sat on the bare mattress and let myself think about Sarah, my ex-wife. She lived in Portland now, 1,500 miles away. We'd been divorced for 2 years, amicable enough, no kids. She'd left because she said I was always preparing for something and never living through anything. And she was right. I'd spent our marriage with one foot in a scenario that hadn't happened yet. And she'd gotten tired of being married to a man who was only half present. She would have called it ironic, that the thing I'd always been half preparing for had finally arrived. And it turned out preparation was the only thing that mattered. But I didn't feel vindicated. I felt the specific grief of someone who'd been right about the wrong thing. I'd have traded every skill I had, every contingency I'd ever mapped, for one more ordinary Tuesday with bad coffee and an argument about whose turn it was to do the dishes. I didn't sleep much that night. On day 9, we found out what a horde sounded like before you could see it. Liam heard it first. He was in the yard. We'd started letting him spend supervised time outdoors because Joe said the confinement was doing more damage than the risk warranted. And he stopped mid-step, turned west, and stood completely still. I was 20 feet away, stacking sandbags along the base of the inner wall, and I thought he'd seen something. But when I followed his gaze, there was nothing. Listen, he said. Just that one word. I stopped. I listened. At first, there was only the wind, the creak of the chain link, the distant sound of Marcus hammering something in the maintenance bay. Then, under all of it, a sound I couldn't immediately identify. Low, arrhythmic, continuous. Like a crowd heard through walls. Like the murmur of a stadium after a play, except it didn't swell and fade. It just persisted, constant and directionless. "Side," I said to Liam. He didn't argue. I got Marcus. We climbed the tower. From the top, looking west, the road was no longer ambiguous. The dark line I'd seen 2 days earlier had resolved. It stretched from the curve where Route 9 emerged from the trees all the way back to where the road disappeared behind a low hill. It was moving, not fast. Nothing about them was fast, but steadily, the way water moves down a very slight grade. Hundreds of them, maybe more. The sound was their feet on asphalt, and the aggregate moan of hundreds of ruined throats producing noise without intent. Marcus didn't say anything for a long time. He lowered the binoculars, raised them again, lowered them. "Quarter mile to the curve," he said finally. "They're past it. Call it 1,000 yards. How long?" "At their speed? They could be at the fence by tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning. Depends on whether they stay on the road or spread into the fields." "What makes them leave the road? Stimulus, noise, maybe nothing. Maybe they just drift." We were speaking quietly, as if volume mattered at this distance. It probably didn't. But the instinct to be small, to be undetectable, was overpowering. "How many?" I asked. He handed me the binoculars. I looked. The column wasn't organized. They didn't march. But it had a rough shape, wider in the middle, tapering at the edges where individuals wandered off axis before correcting back toward the mass. I tried to count and gave up. The road was 2 lanes wide, and the column filled both lanes and spilled onto the shoulders. 300 minimum, Marcus said. Could be 5. Could be more behind the hill. I thought about our ammunition. 2 hunting rifles, the shotgun, Marcus's bow, Joe's .22 pistol. Maybe 200 rounds total across all calibers, against 300 bodies. That math was a death sentence, even if every shot was perfect. "We don't fight them," I said. "We hide." Marcus looked at me. "Explain." "No generator, no lights, no noise. We seal everything, go dark, and hope they pass. And if they don't pass, if they hit the fence and pile up, then we fight from the wall, conserve ammo, aim for the ones on the fence, try to keep the pressure below what the chain link can handle. That's not a plan, that's a prayer. You have a better one." He didn't. We went downstairs and told the others. Joe's face went pale, but she started immediately triaging the medical supplies into a go-bag without being asked. Nora pulled Liam close, and he let her, burying his face against her shoulder for just a moment before pulling away and squaring up. 10 years old, and wearing a man's composure like borrowed clothing. We killed the generator. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. No lights, just concrete and darkness, and, distantly, that low, grinding murmur from the west, growing incrementally closer. I assigned positions. Marcus on the tower, with the compound bow, quiet weapon, no muzzle flash. Me at the western wall with a rifle. Nora and Liam in A block with the shotgun, and instructions I prayed she'd never need. Joe in the infirmary, ready. Then we waited. They reached the fence at 3:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at my watch, using the pale green glow of its hands as an anchor against the dark. The moon was a sliver, useless, and we'd killed every light source. The noise traps were our eyes now. When the first string of cans rattled on the western perimeter, I felt it in my chest before I processed it as sound. I was on the wall, the inner concrete wall, 12 feet high, with a narrow maintenance catwalk along the top that the guards had used during yard emergencies. I lay flat on the catwalk and looked over the edge toward the fence, 15 feet away. They came out of the dark, like a tide finding a seawall. The first ones hit the chain link and it bowed inward, the metal singing with tension, and the sound, the close-range sound, was nothing like what I'd heard from the tower. It was intimate, individual. Each one of them was making a noise, a vocalization that wasn't a moan or a growl, but something between a breath and a word, as if the mechanism of speech was still trying to function without anything behind it. Dozens of these sounds layered together into the drone we'd heard from a distance. But up close, you could hear the separate voices inside it, and that was immeasurably worse. The fence held. The first wave pressed against it, and the chain link flexed, but the posts held, and the razor wire at the top caught the ones that tried to climb, opening wounds they didn't react to, tangling them in coils of steel. Some fell. More pressed in behind them. The fence became a membrane, bulging inward in places, studded with hands and faces, pushing through the diamond-shaped gaps in the wire mesh. I didn't fire. Marcus didn't fire. We'd agreed. Silence as long as possible. For 2 hours, the Horde pressed against the western fence. The noise was constant. Below me, on the other side of the wall, the prison was silent. Nora and Liam sealed in A block. Joe in the infirmary with the door locked and a scalpel in her hand because she'd refused to just sit there unarmed. Around 6 in the morning, the pressure began to shift. I couldn't see well, but I could hear the chain link stress changing. The rattling moving south along the perimeter. They were spreading, flowing around the obstacle like water around a rock, looking for the path of least resistance. Marcus came down from the tower at dawn. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot. "The main body is still on the road," he said. "What's at the fence is the front edge, the overflow. The real mass is still a few hundred yards out, milling." "Why aren't they all at the fence?" "No stimulus. We're dark, we're quiet. The ones at the fence got there by drift. The rest haven't locked onto anything. So our strategy is working. For now. But Cole, that fence isn't going to hold if the main body reaches it. There's too many. The posts will fail." I'd been thinking the same thing. The noise traps had done their job on the perimeter, but they'd also done something I hadn't anticipated. Some of the infected had fixated on the sound of the rattling cans and were concentrating at those points, pressing harder where the traps were. The traps that were supposed to warn us were becoming attractors. "We cut the traps," I said. "If we go outside the wall. I'll go. Through the maintenance bay, around the south side. 5 minutes." "That's insane. If those traps pull the main body to the fence, we lose the perimeter by noon." Marcus stared at me. Then he said, "I'll cover you from the tower. If you get into trouble, I can put an arrow into anything within 50 yards. But beyond that, you're on your own." I went. Moving through the maintenance bay in the dark was like wading through a memory. I knew the layout. The generator housing, the tool racks, the vehicle bay where the transport buses used to park. My hand found the side door by muscle memory. I eased it open and stepped into the gap between the inner wall and the outer fence. The buffer zone, 15 feet of cracked concrete and weeds. On my left, the wall. On my right, the fence, and beyond it, them. I could hear individual footsteps now, the scuff and drag of feet that didn't quite work right. I could smell them. Not the distant sweetness of decay I'd noticed before, but close, rank, the smell of a body that's still producing biological processes, without any of the maintenance that keeps those processes from becoming poison. It was overwhelming. I breathed through my mouth and moved south along the wall. The first noise trap was 20 yards from the maintenance bay door. A simple rig. 3 cans strung on wire between fence posts at ankle height. 2 infected were pressed against the fence at that exact point, their arms through the chain link, reaching toward the cans that had rattled when they'd stumbled into the wire. They were less than 4 feet from me, with only the chain link between us. I crouched. Slowly, keeping every movement controlled, I reached through a gap in the fence mesh and unhooked the wire from its anchor point. The cans dropped softly into the weeds. I gathered them one by one, wrapping each in a strip of cloth from my pocket to muffle any residual noise. The 2 infected at the fence didn't react to my proximity. Their eyes, I could see their eyes in the thin pre-dawn light, were filmed over, but tracking, not me specifically, tracking movement, light, sound. I was below their line of attention, moving slowly enough to avoid registering as stimulus. I'd learned about stimulus thresholds in training, applied to inmates in crisis, the principle that an agitated person will fixate on the most salient stimulus and ignore everything below that threshold. The same principle seemed to apply here, stripped down to its most primitive. I moved to the next trap, and the next. 6 traps along the western and southern perimeter, each one dismantled in silence, the cans pocketed or buried. Twice I froze when an infected on the other side of the fence turned its head in my direction. Both times, it lost interest within seconds. The last trap was at the southeast corner, where the fence made a 90-degree turn. Here, the concentration of infected was thinner, only a handful, wandering aimlessly in the field. But as I crouched to disconnect the wire, I heard something behind me, inside the perimeter. I turned. In the gap between wall and fence, 30 feet north of my position, a figure was moving, lurching, inside the buffer zone. My heart went cold. The fence was intact. I'd checked. The wall was unbroken. But the figure was there, moving toward me with that unmistakable gait, and I realized, with a sick certainty, that it must have been here before I arrived. Inside the perimeter since before I'd locked the gate. Hiding. No, not hiding. It wasn't capable of hiding. Existing somewhere in the complex's sprawl, in a blind spot I hadn't checked. Emerging now because some combination of scent and sound had finally drawn it into motion. I had no gun. I'd left the rifle with Marcus to keep both hands free for the traps. I had a utility knife in my belt, 6 inches of blade against something that didn't feel pain. It closed the distance. 20 feet, 15. I could see it now. A woman, middle-aged, wearing scrubs. A nurse or caretaker, maybe from one of the group homes on the east side of town. Her mouth was open and that half-word sound was coming from her throat, rising in pitch as she got closer, and I knew that sound would carry. I stood up. I met it. The knife went in below the jaw, angled upward, and the sound stopped. I held the body as it went slack, lowering it to the ground to avoid the noise of a fall. My hand was shaking, not from fear exactly, from the closeness of it, the physicality, the warmth that was still in her skin, because these things weren't dead the way dead was supposed to work. They were something else, something that used the body's remaining heat like fuel in an engine that no one was steering. I left her in the buffer zone and went back through the maintenance bay and locked the door behind me and washed my hands in the infirmary sink 3 times. Jo watched me from across the room. She didn't ask. I think my face told her everything. By midday, the main body of the Horde had shifted. Marcus reported from the tower that the column on the road was bending south, drawn by something we couldn't identify. A sound, a stimulus, another group of survivors making noise somewhere beyond our sight line. The infected at our fence were thinning. Not gone, but the pressure had eased. The chain link was still standing. Deformed in places, 3 posts visibly leaning, but intact. We allowed ourselves to breathe, not relax. Nobody relaxed. But the immediate terror of the fence collapsing under sheer mass receded enough that I could think beyond the next 30 minutes. I gathered everyone in the kitchen, even Liam, because keeping him in the dark felt more dangerous than the truth. He sat next to Nora, his posture straight and attentive. The Western novel was in his back pocket. "We got lucky," I said. "The Horde drifted. But we need to plan for the next one, because there will be a next one." "The fence needs repair," Marcus said. 3 posts on the western side are compromised. 1 good push and that section is down. Materials, we've got angle iron left. Concrete mix in the maintenance bay. Old, but it'll set. I need 6 hours and another pair of hands. "You'll have mine," I said. "What about the one inside?" Jo said quietly. Everyone looked at her, then at me. "There was one inside the perimeter," I said. "In the buffer zone. I dealt with it. But it means our initial sweep wasn't thorough enough. We need to go through every room, every corridor, every closet in this building. If there's another one, I want to find it before it finds us. Nora stood up. I'll do the sweep. Joe, can you walk? I can walk. Then we go together. Every room, every block. Liam, you stay in the hub with the door locked. No, Liam said. It was only his fourth or fifth word since arriving, and the force behind it surprised everyone. I go with you. Nora started to object, but something in his face stopped her. This wasn't a child's defiance. It was a calculated refusal to be separated from the only person he trusted. I understood it. In here, alone, was the most dangerous thing you could be. He goes with you, I said. Stay in sight of each other. Every door gets opened, every room gets checked. Clear it by sundown. The sweep took 5 hours. They found nothing. No infected, no signs of habitation, no breach points we'd missed. What they did find, in a storage closet in C block that I'd overlooked during my initial inventory, were 2 cases of bottled water, a crate of powdered soup mix, and a box of emergency candles, supplies left behind during decommissioning, forgotten in a closet nobody had opened in years. Small mercies. We measured everything in small mercies now. Marcus and I spent the afternoon outside, between the walls, repairing the fence. Working in the buffer zone with the knowledge that infected were still scattered in the fields beyond the wire was a specific kind of discipline. Every sound we made, every hammer strike, every scrape of metal, felt like a beacon. We worked as quietly as possible, using hand signals when we could, speaking in murmurs when we couldn't. At one point, Marcus paused, wiped his forehead, and looked at me over a fence post he was bracing. You know this isn't sustainable, right? Define sustainable. Food runs out, ammo runs out, generator fuel runs out. This place keeps us alive in the short term, but it's a box. Eventually, a box becomes a coffin. Fort Kessler, 40 miles through open country, with a kid, a woman with a bad ankle, and no vehicle. My truck was still in the yard, but the fuel gauge had been near empty when I arrived, and I'd used the reserve to top off the generator. Without fuel, the truck was a 2-ton paperweight. One problem at a time, I said. That's not planning, that's deferring. You're right. But the alternative is panicking about everything at once, and I've seen what that does to people. One problem at a time, Marcus. Today the problem is this fence. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded and went back to work. But the conversation sat between us for the rest of the afternoon like a stone in a shoe, something I could feel with every step but couldn't afford to stop and address. Day 12 brought the rain, and with it, a stranger. The rain started before dawn. A hard, driving March rain that turned the fields to mud and reduced visibility from the tower to less than 100 yards. Marcus hated it. Blind spots everywhere, sound masked by the downpour, the fence posts we'd just repaired shifting and softening ground. He doubled the watch, which meant nobody slept more than 3 hours at a stretch. The stranger appeared at the south gate around noon, a man, alone, unarmed. He stood in the rain with his hands raised, swaying slightly, and Nora spotted him from the tower before the rest of us knew he was there. His name was Gil Oberlin, 50s, thin, soaking wet, wearing a raincoat over a county sheriff's department uniform. No badge, no weapon, no belt. He looked like someone had stripped him of everything that made him an authority figure and left the body standing. We brought him in through the maintenance bay. The south gate was our secondary entrance, and we'd agreed not to open the main western gate again unless absolutely necessary. He stumbled inside and stood dripping on the concrete floor, and the first thing he said was, "How many are you?" "5," I said. "How many are you?" "Just me, now." He'd been part of a group of 11 holed up in the Sutterton Community Center on the west side of town. They'd held it for 8 days before the infected had broken through a basement window someone had thought was too small to matter. He'd escaped through a roof hatch. The others hadn't. He told us this in a flat, mechanical voice while Joe checked him for bites, and Nora handed him dry clothes from the laundry room. No bites, no scratches. Just a man emptied out by what he'd witnessed and running on residual momentum. I was a deputy for 22 years, he said, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of powdered soup steaming between his hands. I know this town. I know these people. Knew them. He looked at the soup like it was a foreign object. The ones at the community center, I watched them turn. Not from bites, from giving up. People just stopped talking, sat down and waited. And I couldn't know how to. He stopped. The sentence didn't end so much as dissolve. Marcus and I exchanged a look. The same concern was in both of us. Gil was a resource. He knew the town, the roads, the terrain, but he was also shattered. And shattered people were unpredictable. You're safe here, I told him. Rest. We'll talk in the morning. But we didn't rest, because at 2 a.m, the rain stopped, and the silence that replaced it was filled, almost immediately, with the sound we'd been dreading. Cans weren't rattling. We dismantled the traps. But Marcus, on watch, heard the fence. The specific sound of chain link under distributed pressure. He woke me with a hand on my shoulder and 2 words. They're back. Bigger this time. The rain had changed their patterns, pushed groups together, funneled them along drainage channels and roads where the water had carved paths of least resistance directly toward our position. From the tower, I could see the western fence bowing inward along its entire length, not just at weak points, but everywhere. A continuous wave of pressure that made the metal scream. And then the southeast corner. The section we hadn't reinforced because it had seemed secure, buckled. 2 posts folded inward simultaneously, and a 10-foot section of chain link collapsed, and they poured through the gap into the buffer zone, like water through a broken levee. Wall positions, I shouted, and the silence protocol died in the space of a second. Marcus was on the tower, arrows flying. Each one found a target. He didn't miss at that range. But each target replaced itself with 2 more behind it. I was on the western wall with the rifle, firing into the mass at the fence breach, and every shot echoed across the fields. And I knew the sound was pulling more of them in, that every gunshot was an invitation. But there was no alternative because they were inside the perimeter now, in the buffer zone, pressing against the base of the inner wall. The wall held. 12 feet of poured concrete, and they couldn't climb it. Their coordination was too degraded for vertical surfaces. They pressed against it and clawed at it, and the sound of dozens of hands scraping concrete was a sound I will carry in my body for the rest of my life. But they couldn't get over. The breach lasted 40 minutes. Then, as before, something drew the mass away. A sound from the south, distant, maybe another group of survivors, maybe a building collapsing, maybe nothing. The pressure eased. The ones in the buffer zone milled aimlessly, losing coherence now that the momentum of the horde was gone, becoming individuals again, purposeless and slow. Marcus picked them off from the tower. 18 arrows, 18 bodies in the buffer zone by dawn. We'd used 31 rifle rounds. We had 112 left. Gil came to me that afternoon while I was counting ammunition at the hub desk. He'd been quiet during the breach. I'd told him to stay in A block with Liam, and he had. Sitting on the floor of the corridor with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, not sleeping, just absent. You need to leave this place, he said. I didn't look up from the ammo count. We've discussed that. You've discussed the math. I'm telling you about the geography. He pulled a chair over and sat. Up close, in the daylight from the hub windows, he looked 10 years older than his actual age. I know the roads between here and Kessler. I've driven them 1,000 times. Route 9 south to Highway 14, then east to 94, then south again on county roads. There's a way to do it that avoids the main corridors. On foot? With a 10-year-old? There's fuel. I looked up. The Public Works Depot, he said. North side of town, off Millard Road. County vehicles. Plows, dump trucks, service vans. They keep a 500-gallon diesel tank and a 200-gallon gasoline reserve. Underground storage. The infected won't have touched it. They don't know it's there. I've got the access codes. The north side of town it's bad, I know. But the depot is on the outskirts. Fenced lot, industrial building, set back from residential areas. It's reachable. I sat with this. The ammunition math was staring at me from the desk. 112 rounds. The next horde might be twice the size. The fence was now breached in one section and weakened along its entire western face. The wall had held, but Marcus had pointed out stress fractures in 2 places that hadn't been there before. Walls work until they don't. Then they're just rooms you can't get out of. How far is the depot from here? 4 miles, through fields, not roads. We go at night, avoid the main streets. 2 people, fast and quiet, in and out. With what containers? Your truck has a tank. Drive it there, fill it, drive it back. Then you've got transport. Then you've got a choice. A choice. The word felt luxurious, almost obscene. We'd been operating without choices for 12 days. Only reactions. Only the next wall to brace, the next breach to survive. The idea that we could choose something, could move toward a destination instead of just holding position, was disorienting. I'll go, I said. You navigate. You and me. You know the route. I know how to move in the dark. Marcus holds the prison. When? Tomorrow night. New moon. I told the others over dinner. Powdered soup again, stretched thin, the taste of it already so familiar it had stopped registering as food. Marcus didn't like it. Not the plan itself. He agreed we needed fuel and options. But the risk. You're the one who built this, he said. Meaning the defense, the protocol, the structure. If you don't come back, then you're in charge. You're better at the tactical piece than I am anyway. I'm better at defending a position. You're better at making people believe they can hold one. That's not the same thing. It was the closest Marcus had come to saying something about leadership that sounded like trust. I didn't know how to respond to it, so I said, "We leave at midnight. We'll be back before dawn." Nora caught me alone in the corridor afterward. "You trust him, Gil?" "He has no reason to lie. He has every reason to fall apart at the wrong moment. He's not stable, Cole. You can see it." "I can. But he's also the only person here who knows where the fuel is. Take Marcus instead. Gil can draw you a map. Marcus has to stay. He's the only one who can defend this place if something goes wrong while we're gone." She stood there in the dim corridor, backlit by a single emergency candle, and I could see her working through the same calculations I had, arriving at the same answer and hating it. "Come back," she said. Not a request, an instruction. We left at midnight on day 13. Gil and I went through the east fence, where the fields were open and the infected concentration was lowest. The moon was gone. True dark. The kind where your eyes never fully adjust and you navigate by memory and the feel of the ground under your feet. Gil moved well in the dark, better than I'd expected. The 22 years of law enforcement had put something in his body that exhaustion and trauma couldn't fully erase. We crossed the first field in silence, moving north-northeast, angling toward the far side of town. The grass was wet from the rain 2 days earlier, and our boots made soft sucking sounds in the mud. Every 50 yards, we'd stop, listen, and continue. The night was full of small sounds. Insects, wind, the distant creak of something structural settling. But nothing that sounded like them. Not yet. At the tree line between the second field and the edge of the residential area, Gil held up a fist and we stopped. Ahead, through the trees, I could see rooftops silhouetted against the faintly lighter sky. Houses. Dark, all of them. No lights anywhere. "We skirt the neighborhood," he whispered. "Follow the creek bed north. It runs behind the backyards and comes out near Millard Road." The creek bed was shallow. Ankle-deep water over mud and gravel, and the banks were high enough to screen us from view. We moved in the water, which masked our footsteps, but soaked through my boots and turned my feet to ice within minutes. Gil seemed not to notice. We saw our first infected after 20 minutes. A lone figure standing in a backyard, motionless, facing a wooden fence like it had been walking in that direction, and simply stopped when it encountered the barrier. It didn't react to us. We passed within 30 feet of it, hidden by the creek bank, and it stood there like a broken compass needle pointing at nothing. 3 more near the intersection of Millard Road and the creek. These were moving. That aimless shuffle, no direction, no purpose. Gil and I lay flat against the bank and waited. They passed. It took 15 minutes for them to drift far enough that we could move. The depot was exactly where Gil said it would be. A concrete block building behind an 8-foot chain-link fence with a locked gate. The parking lot held 4 county vehicles, 2 pickup trucks, a flatbed, and a snowplow with the blades still attached. Gil punched a code into the gate lock's keypad, and nothing happened. No power, he said. The keypad was electronic. My stomach dropped. This was the scenario I hadn't planned for. The simple, stupid failure of an assumption that unravels everything. But Gil reached into his pocket and produced a key, tarnished and bent. Master override. Every deputy carries one. The gate opened. The fuel tanks were behind the building. 2 underground tanks with manual pump handles, the kind you crank by hand. I unscrewed the cap on one and the smell of gasoline rose in the cold air, sharp and beautiful. We'd brought collapsible water containers. 4 of them, 5 gallons each. I filled them while Gil kept watch, cranking the pump handle with a rhythm that felt agonizingly loud in the silence. Each revolution produced a gush of fuel and a metallic squeak that carried further than I wanted to think about. 20 gallons, enough to fill the truck, enough to reach Fort Kessler and then some. We loaded the containers into a handcart Gil found in the depot's tool shed and started back. The return trip was slower. The cart's wheels were loud on gravel, and we had to carry it through the creek bed, one of us on each end, the fuel sloshing in the containers with every step. We were a quarter mile from Hargrove, crossing the last open field, when Gil stopped walking. "Wait," he said. I waited. He was looking south, toward the tree line, and in the faint shift of the sky that precedes dawn by an hour, I could see what he was seeing. Figures. Dozens of them, emerging from the trees in a loose wave, moving north across the field. Toward us. Toward the prison. "Go," I said. "Now." We ran. The cart bounced and rattled over the uneven ground, gasoline splashing from a container whose cap hadn't seated properly. And behind us, the loose wave tightened, drawn by the sound, and I could hear the first of them finding their tempo, that slow acceleration from shuffle to something faster that I hadn't known they could do. We hit the east fence at a sprint. Marcus was there. He'd been watching from the tower and had come down to open the gate. We hauled the cart through, he slammed the gate shut and wired it, and the first infected reached the fence 8 seconds later. 8 seconds. Gil collapsed on the concrete inside the wall, gasping. I stood there with my hands on my knees, watching the fence shudder as bodies pressed against it, and thought, we almost didn't make it. An extra minute at the depot, a slower pace through the creek, one wrong turn, and we'd be out there with them. The fuel containers sat on the ground beside me, 20 gallons of gasoline and the possibility of escape, and I looked at them and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since this started. Hope, fragile and dangerous and completely irrational. The decision to leave Hargrove took less time than I expected. I thought there would be argument, debate, kind of protracted discussion that breaks groups apart. But when I laid out the situation in the kitchen the next morning, fuel in hand, route planned, Fort Kessler as destination, the response was quiet and immediate. Marcus nodded. Joe started packing medical supplies. Nora looked at Liam, and Liam looked back at her, and some communication passed between them that didn't require language. Gil was the one who hesitated. "I came here to be inside walls," he said. "Now you're asking me to leave them." "I'm asking all of us to leave them. The walls are failing. You saw what happened last night. They came from a new direction, from the trees. They're not following roads anymore. They're spreading. The next horde won't just test the fence. It'll surround us. And on the road? What surrounds us on the road? Nothing. Everything. The difference is, we'll be moving. We won't be trapped. Gil stared at his hands for a long time. Then he said, I watched 11 people die because we stayed too long in a building we thought was safe. I won't watch that again. We planned to leave at dusk on day 15. That gave us 30 hours to prepare the truck, load supplies, plan the route, and this was the part nobody said aloud. Say goodbye to the structure that had kept us alive. I walked the prison one last time that afternoon. A block, where we'd slept and cooked and held our frightened meetings. B block, empty and echoing, the buffer we'd never needed. The hub, where I'd sat with the radio and heard a military voice tell us help wasn't coming. The tower, where I'd watched the horde materialize out of the western dark like a nightmare gaining mass. The maintenance bay, where the woman in scrubs had come out of the shadows, and I'd killed her with a utility knife and washed my hands 3 times and still felt the warmth of her skin on my palm. I didn't feel nostalgic. That wasn't the right word. I felt the way you feel when you leave a hospital after a long illness. Grateful and repulsed and unable to separate the two. Marcus loaded the truck with military precision. Supplies in the bed, secured under a tarp. Weapons accessible. The rifles and shotgun in the cab, his bow behind the seat. Water and food for 3 days. Medical kit. The hand crank radio. Extra fuel and 2 containers strapped to the tailgate. 6 people in a single cab truck with a bench seat. It would be brutal. Joe, Nora, and Liam in the cab. Marcus in the bed with Gil under the tarp, watching the road behind us. Me driving. The route. East on farm roads to avoid Route 9. Then south on a county road Gil knew that paralleled Highway 94 without touching it. 40 miles to Fort Kessler. At safe speeds, accounting for obstacles and the need to stop and scout intersections. Gil estimated 4 to 5 hours. After 15 days behind concrete walls, 5 hours of open road felt like crossing an ocean. At dusk, we gathered in the yard. The truck was loaded. The gate was ready. I looked at the prison. The watchtower, the walls, the western fence still deformed from the horde's pressure. And I felt a strange compulsion to apologize to it. To thank it. It had held. Not perfectly, not without cost, but it had held. Liam was standing beside the truck. He looked up at me and said it in the longest continuous speech he'd produced since arriving. Will there be walls where we're going? I think so. Different walls. Good. I'm tired of these ones. I almost smiled. It was the most childlike thing he'd said, and it was also the most honest assessment any of us had offered. We got in the truck. I started the engine. Marcus and Gil settled in the bed. I drove to the gate, got out, unwired it, swung it open, got back in, and pulled through. I didn't close the gate behind us. There was no one left to protect. The first hour was the worst. Farm roads at night with no headlights. Gil's insistence, and he was right. Headlights would be visible for miles in flat country. I drove by moonlight, which was barely enough to distinguish road from ditch, and the truck crawled at 15 miles per hour along a gravel surface that could have hidden anything. Every shadow was a threat. Every cluster of trees was an ambush. I gripped the wheel so tightly my fingers cramped, and beside me, Nora sat with the shotgun across her knees and Liam pressed between her and Joe, his eyes wide and reflecting the faint light. A mile out from Hargrove, we passed through a section of road flanked by abandoned farmhouses. Something moved in one of the yards. Multiple shapes, low and quick. And I accelerated without thinking, the gravel spraying under the tires, the truck fishtailing slightly. And whatever was in the yard receded behind us. Nobody spoke. We reached the county road and turned south. The surface was better here. Paved, maintained, wide enough that I could see the shoulders clearly. Gil tapped on the rear window and pointed left. Through the glass I could see what he was indicating. a dark mass on the road ahead, stretching across both lanes. I slowed. Cars, dozens of them. An evacuation queue that had stalled and never restarted. Sedans, SUVs, a school bus. Doors open on some, windows broken on others. The vehicles were arranged in a rough column, as if everyone had been driving in the same direction when they'd stopped simultaneously. I couldn't drive through. The road was completely blocked. Shoulder, Nora said quietly. The right shoulder was narrow but passable, a strip of packed earth between the road surface and a drainage ditch. I eased the truck onto it, the passenger side tilting toward the ditch, and we crept along the line of abandoned vehicles at walking speed. I didn't look inside the cars. I told myself not to look, and mostly I succeeded. But at one point, the truck passed close enough to a minivan that I couldn't avoid seeing the car seat in the back, empty, the straps unbuckled and hanging loose. The absence was worse than anything presence could have been. The stalled traffic extended for nearly a mile. On the other side, the road opened up, and I brought the truck back to the center and allowed myself to breathe. Marcus tapped the rear window again. I glanced in the mirror. He was pointing behind us, urgently. I looked at the road in the rear view and saw them. Figures emerging from the stalled vehicles, from between the cars and from underneath them, drawn out by the sound of our engine. They accumulated in the road behind us, like a wake forming behind a boat, except this wake was made of bodies, and it was growing. I pressed the accelerator. 20 miles an hour. 25. The gravel section was behind us, and the paved road was clear, and I pushed it to 35, which was as fast as I was willing to go without headlights. The figures in the mirror fell behind. Eventually, I couldn't see them at all. Liam's hand found mine on the seat between us. Small, cold, gripping with surprising strength. I didn't pull away. 2 hours in, Gil directed me off the county road onto a smaller route that cut through a stretch of pine forest. The trees closed in overhead, and the darkness became absolute. I had no choice. I turned on the headlights. The road ahead appeared in sharp relief. Narrow, cracked, lined with pines, and utterly empty. We drove through the forest for 40 minutes and saw nothing. No infected, no vehicles, no signs of humanity. Just trees and road and the cone of yellow light pushing back the dark. It was the most peaceful 40 minutes I'd experienced since before the world ended, and it felt wrong, like a held breath, like the pause between the flash and the thunder. The forest ended abruptly. The road emerged onto high ground, and the opened up before us. Rolling hills, scattered farmsteads, and in the distance, visible even in the dark, a cluster of lights. Actual lights. Electric, steady. Kessler, Gil said from the truck bed, and his voice cracked on the second syllable. We reached the outer checkpoint at 3:22 in the morning. Concrete barriers, concertina wire, 2 armored vehicles, and soldiers, real soldiers, with vision and rifles, and the haunted competence of people who had been holding a line for weeks. They processed us in a tent that smelled like diesel and coffee. They checked us for bites with the detached thoroughness of people who had done this hundreds of times and had learned not to feel it. They separated us for individual screening and brought us back together in a waiting area, where a woman in army fatigues gave Liam a juice box, and he held it in both hands and stared at it like an artifact from a civilization he'd almost forgotten. I sat on a folding chair and listened to the sounds of a functioning perimeter, generators, radio chatter, boots on gravel, and waited for the relief to come. It didn't. Not yet. What instead was the weight of everything I'd deferred. Dennis Pruitt in the parking lot, the woman in scrubs, the car seat with the unbuckled straps, 11 people in a community center that Gil couldn't save, the sound of hands on concrete in the dark. Nora sat down beside me. Liam was asleep on a cot across the tent, his breathing finely even and deep. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "You built something back there. You know that, right? It wasn't the walls. It was the reason to stay inside them." I looked at my hands. The same hands that had turned the key on the prison gate, that had held the knife, that had gripped the wheel for 5 hours through the dark. They were shaking slightly. They hadn't stopped shaking since the checkpoint. I thought about Hargrove. The gate I'd left open. The walls standing empty in the dark, with nobody inside them to protect. A fortress with no purpose, waiting for a horde that would wash over it and through it and past it without resistance. It had kept us alive long enough to leave. That's what walls are for. Not forever, just long enough.